So just a couple of more points along the same thing. We want to see. We stopped here. This is again showing records of the so-called Plio-Pleistocene boundaries going from about 5 million years to the present, and along the way there have been changes in the way climate cycles happened. Before the so-called Pleistocene started around 2 million years ago, and we have had about 9 or 10 of these 100,000 year ice age cycles that we talked about in the other context before. Before that, this is more of the orbital time scale of ellipticity change, even though ellipticity change doesn't introduce so much change in radiation forcing, but it tends to combine with precession and give you some kind of a beat. But nonetheless, there is no direct correspondence between the time scales in the orbital forcing and ice ages, because internal feedbacks happen in terms of ice albedo feedback and so on. But the initiation of ice ages seems to be heavily dependent on orbital forcing, as we talked about before. Radiation changes at 65 north, which can determine whether the ice will continue to melt into the winter or build for the next year, and so on and so forth. Before that, we had more of a obliquity cycle, which is 41,000 years, and over this time the climate continued to be cooler and more variable. This is often raised as an issue of why humanity didn't become as dominant and as modern as we are now, in a whatever that modern means. On a continental scale, if you zoom into that, you can see that there was drier, so cooler, but also drier and more variable in terms of dust composition in the various evidences collected from ocean sediments and ice cores. Well, not really ice cores, but mostly ocean sediments and rocks and other things. And you can see this art form here, which shows this dry savanna kind of vegetation over East Africa. East Africa is critical because the so-called molecular clock or genetic tracing back takes us all back to East Africa, and it's pretty much clear that the evolution of human beings, our ancestors, even Homo lineage, from our Australopithecus, Paranthropus, and so on, happened over East Africa in terms of genetic emanation. And so the change in climate, as I mentioned, from here where there was more rainfall over East Africa and it was green lush vegetation where there was plenty of food, it was easy to hide from the predators, easy to find food. But here you would have to run faster, go farther to find food, or run away from predators and so on, which is argued to have led to bipedalism, because if you look at our ancestors like gorillas and chimps, they are mostly quadrupedal, which is slower in the long run. This endurance is also much higher when you are bipedal. And then the idea is that the connection between the spine and the cranium changes when you stand upright versus being quadrupedal. Here are some ancestors here, and that would allow maybe the cranium to grow and the brain to fill the space. Or there are also ideas that the fire control and eating cooked food released jaw muscles and allowed the cranium to grow. So lots of hypotheses. Nonetheless, if you go back and look again at the delta O18 evidence going from the same few million year time scale back, and look at East African soil carbon paleosoil evidences going from woodlands to grasslands over this region where the split happens from Australopithecus, Ardipithecus, Kenyanthropus, and so on, and these lineages disappearing to the Homo lineage evolving and to becoming the Homo sapiens. And there is the evolution of tools along the way. And if you look at other depictions of the same time scale, you are going from increased climate fluctuations, which are held responsible for hominin origins and habitual bipedality here in this time scale at 4 million years ago, so Ardipithecus to Australopithecus, and then Paranthropus and Homo lineages, so the first stone and tool making and eating meat and marrow from large animals, which would require tools to break the bones and extract the marrow. So D is the onset of long endurance mobility, which allowed migrations around the globe out of Africa hypothesis, and onset of rapid brain enlargement, and then expansion of symbolic expression, innovation, cultural diversity, and so on and so forth. Of course, population growth exploded after we settled down as agricultural communities, because the hunter-gatherers who used to move a lot with families, fertility rates were lower. Settling down and having family structure, childcare made the women more fertile, population began to grow, and so on and so forth. So climate and carbon and human evolution are intimately tied in this scenario, and climate also allowed these migrations going here from Olduvai to Turkana, Haidar, and into the European regions, Asian regions, and maritime regions, and of course back and forth. All these would have been facilitated either by climate drivers here making it necessary to leave, or favorable climates to allow to go, which is related to this onset of long endurance mobility and so on. So you can see the time scales involved here. So if climate is indeed a critical part of our evolution, then is it natural that we continue to change climate? Well, I don't know. You can also ask whether, if all life forms are basically consuming energy, producing pollution, and dissipating energy, and everything in the universe is dissipating energy, then are we just supposed to evolve to dissipate energy at a very fast rate? Obviously we become very good at it. But the other debate that gets even more controversial is to say that increased CO2 because of human activities, let's say over the Holocene, actually is been attributed to increased productivity through so-called carbon fertilization, where the increased carbon in the atmosphere and the warming associated with it have driven increased biomass. And this is from satellite data looking just at 1982 to 2015. And there are people who have argued that if we don't increase the temperature but just increase carbon, we may in fact drive a lot of greening and increased biomass productivity of crops and vegetation and so on. So this is true in terms of leaf area index, but over parts of India this increase is largely attributed to agricultural change. In China it is related more to the increase in actual forest cover. So obviously the impact on carbon sequestration is very different when you have agricultural activity increasing leaf area index and so-called greening, because that doesn't sequester so much carbon into the soil, whereas as forest does. So obviously one has to be careful. So these questions kind of are complicated in the sense that there is heuristic arguments about whether increased carbon dioxide itself has allowed us to become so large in population and feed ourselves so well, and then evolve into this technology beasts, or whether this is all heading towards just large-scale geoengineering that is not that's a mess. It's unintended Frankenstein experiments rather than intended geoengineering that is going to produce a better world, right? So these are debates that should go on, but we will get back to carbon cycle in the present and put it in the context of future carbon cycle, not so much in the greenhouse gas and climate change perspective, but going back to our CO2 politics kind of idea as to where we are headed and what it means in the context of substances under geoengineering, which is what we are discussing here. Okay, so that's a very brief run through carbon cycle, past and present, including a context for human evolution, energy, and carbon cycle.